The Norwood Builder by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. The Return of Sherlock Holmes. Holmes and I sat drinking our tea one afternoon when he said, "Watson, it has been very boring here lately. There are no interesting cases lately." "I don't think the people here would agree with you, Holmes," I said. "I guess you are right," he said, pushing back his chair and standing up. "It is better if there are no cases for detectives to solve." Holmes went over to his chair and picked up the newspaper. Just as he began to read, there was a knock at the door. I heard the servant open the door and then footsteps running up the stairs. The door opened and a frightened man stood in the doorway. "Please, Mr. Holmes, I need your help," the man said. "I am John Hector McFarlane. I am sure you have heard of me." "I don't know who you are, sorry," Holmes said. "I can see you are a lawyer and not married though." This didn't surprise me at all. Holmes had a way of doing this with people, but the man was very surprised. "You are right," the man said. "Can you please help me? I am the unhappiest man in London today. The police will be here soon. I know they must have followed me here, but I can only go with them if you agree to help me." At this information, Holmes looked very happy. This could be his interesting case he was looking for. "The police are coming?" he said. "Please tell me more. Why are they looking for you?" "They think I killed a man named Jonas Oldacre," McFarlane said. "I see you haven't been reading the paper. Look at this article. Fire in Lower Norwood. Rich man disappears. Is he dead? Was he killed in the fire?" I quickly read the article and saw that the police said they wanted to question Mr. McFarlane. "They think I wanted his money and killed him for it," McFarlane said. "I don't want to know what my mother will think when she finds out. What am I going to do? Will you please help me, Mr. Holmes?" Mr. McFarlane was a young man about 27 years old. He had fair hair and his clothes were expensive. It seems he had plenty of money. I looked at Sherlock Holmes and he was sitting in his chair with his eyes closed. I began reading the article to him. "Late last night, or early this morning, on Sydenham Road in Lower Norwood, there was a fire at Deepdene House, the home owned by Mr. Jonas Oldacre. Mr. Oldacre is missing, and the police fear he is dead. Mr. Oldacre is well known in the area, being a retired builder. He is 62 years old and unmarried. He has few friends. Mr. Oldacre kept a lot of wood in the back of the house, where the fire appears to have started about 12 o'clock last night. It seemed like an ordinary fire until someone noticed that the owner of the house was not there, and there were a lot of papers in one room and a sign of a fight. There was a stick and blood on the floor of this room. The police know that Mr. Oldacre has a visitor last night, a lawyer by the name of Mr. John Hector McFarlane, and it is believed the stick belongs to him. There was also evidence that something heavy was pulled through the grass from the house to the fire. Something was found, an animal or person, where the wood was in the back of the house. The police think it may be Mr. Oldacre and are looking for Mr. McFarlane in connection to the case. Mr. Lestrade of Scotland Yard is working on the case." "Why, Mr. McFarlane, has the police not found you yet?" Holmes said when he opened his eyes. "I didn't go home last night. I live with my mother and father at Torrington Lodge in Blackheath," said Mr. McFarlane. "I did see Mr. Oldacre last night, and when we finished, it was so late I decided to stay in a hotel in Norwood. I didn't want to wake my parents coming home so late. I think the police will find me today, maybe even come here." Just as he finished, there was another knock at the door. We heard voices and footsteps coming up the stairs of more than one person. It was our friend Lestrade, the detective from Scotland Yard, and his assistant. Lestrade looked directly at Mr. McFarlane and said, "John McFarlane, you must come with me. We want to speak to you in the connection of the death of Jonas Oldacre." Mr. McFarlane looked pale and stood up. "Sit down, everyone," Holmes said. "We can discuss this calmly, and taking 30 more minutes won't hurt anything." Mr. McFarlane was just beginning to tell us his story. "Well, since it is you, Mr. Holmes, I can wait a little longer," Lestrade said, sitting down. "Thank you, Lestrade," Holmes said. "Now, Mr. McFarlane, please continue." "As of yesterday, I have never heard of Mr. Oldacre except his name. He was an old friend of my parents, but they haven't seen him for years. It was very unexpected when he came to my office yesterday. Mr. Oldacre had his will with him, which I have here. He asked me to make a copy. He said he would wait until I finished. When I began reading it, I saw that he wanted to leave all his money to me when he died. I couldn't believe it and asked him why. He told me he had no children, and since he knew my father, he wanted me to have his money. I was still very surprised. I thanked him, of course, and made his copy as quickly as I could. When it was finished, he asked me to go to his house to look at some more papers he had there. He then asked me one final thing, not to tell my parents because he wanted it to be a surprise. Since he was so kind, I wanted to honor his request, so I sent a message to my parents and said I might not be home that night. I often had to stay in other places since my work took me away from home, so I knew they would understand. Mr. Oldacre asked me to arrive at 9, but I got lost a little and didn't arrive until 9:30. Holmes then interrupted and said, "Who opened the door?" "There was an old woman, but I didn't get her name," he said. "Did she know your name?" Holmes asked. "She seems to," Mr. McFarlane said. "She led me into a room where there was a simple meal waiting. I ate, and after I finished, Mr. Oldacre came and took me to another room. There was a cupboard there with a lot of important papers of his that we worked on till about 11:30. Mr. Oldacre told me to leave by the back door so I didn't wake the old woman who was sleeping. I took my stick, and when I was leaving, I couldn't find it. Mr. Oldacre told me he would return it later since we would be working together more in the future. So, when I left him, there were papers on the table and the cupboard was still open. Like I said, I didn't want to disturb my parents and go back to Blackheath. So I stayed at the Early Arms in Norwood. When I woke up the next morning, I heard about the fire and read it in the paper. Lestrade had been listening quietly and finally said, "Have you heard all you need to hear, Holmes?" "I would like to go to Blackheath first," Holmes said. "Do you mean Norwood?" Lestrade asked. "Maybe later," Holmes said. Lestrade turned to McFarlane and said, "There are 2 policemen waiting outside that you must go with." McFarlane sadly left the room and walked away with the policemen. Holmes began to look at the papers McFarlane left. "These are very interesting,"